Well, good afternoon. My name is Matthew Goodman. I hold the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS, and I'm also Senior Advisor for Asian Economics. Welcome to CSIS and to the launch of our exciting new Reconnecting Asia project. Let me also welcome our online viewers. We have a loyal viewership. Actually, you picked a good day to stay at your desk because we're going to be standing remotely here, I think, today. So a few administrative announcements to start with. The usual, please silence your electronic devices if you could. Second, if there is any kind of emergency, then we have exits behind me here, or we can go down the main stairs and assemble in the little park across the street. Just follow my lead. And I think that's all for administrative things. As most of you know, there's a competition, mostly friendly competition, underway across the Eurasian landmass and its maritime periphery with regional powers, China, Japan, Russia, India, and others, ramping up their infrastructure spending and their plans to invest. Some have called this a revival of the partly true, partly mythical Silk routes that existed between Asia and Europe 1,000 years ago. But these new connections are being formed via hard infrastructure like roads, railroads, ports, and so forth, which could deepen integration and expand prosperity. They also have the potential to reconfigure relationships, reroute flows of goods and people, and shift power within and between states. But a number of questions arise about the feasibility of the underlying projects, which face obstacles as big and diverse as the region itself. In a world in which 90% of trade currently travels by sea, can new overland routes compete? Another question is, beyond the physical terrain, can these projects successfully navigate difficult political and legal terrain? Also, even if the hard infrastructure is in place, will the soft infrastructure, customs and border procedures, for example, be adequate to facilitate trade and commerce? So Reconnecting Asia is trying to tackle questions like this, and we're doing that by first trying to establish what's really going on the ground. And that's what the website we're about to show you is designed to do. This project has three things in common with the projects it tracks. First, it's ambitious, covering a region that contains over 1/3 of the world's landmass and more than half of global GDP. Second, it's a public good, created as part of CSIS's mission to help citizens and decision makers chart a course toward a better world. And third, it's a work in progress, and we really welcome input. In fact, we need input to help improve and build out this site. You'll see this is a good start, but we have a lot of work to be done here. So this is a project that only CSIS could conceive of and pull off. Many people made it happen, and I want to acknowledge them now. First, thanks to the Brzezinski Institute on Geostrategy and its executive director, Josie Gable, who showed tireless leadership in steering the website to this point that you're going to see today. Thanks to the superb technical team, Paul Franz and his team in our in-house ideas lab, who brought the site to life and created a lot of the original features you'll see. And thanks in particular to our large and enthusiastic team of researchers and interns, current and past. There are many people who have contributed to this, as well as advisors. We have in-house advisors, other programs at CSIS that are very involved in aspects of this story, and we have some outside advisors who've helped us as well tremendously, and we really appreciate that support. Finally, I'm excited to announce a new media partnership, which we will be engaging in on this project with the Nikkei group in Japan, including Nikkei Asian Review. We both stand to benefit enormously from this collaboration by sharing information, insights, and by extension, we hope you'll benefit from this as well. So with that, let me now kick off our presentation. I'm going to show you a brief video to get your sort of juices going about the project. And then my colleague, John Hillman, who is director of the Reconnecting Asia project, will come up and help walk through the site. And then we will have an expert panel to come up. And finally, after the briefest of coffee breaks, we're going to have Dr. Hamre and Dr. Brzezinski up here having a conversation about to put this in a broader context. So with that, if I could ask for the lights to be dimmed, and I think I can make this work if I push to the site and then push again, right, Paul?
The supercontinent of Eurasia is home to 60% of the global economy and 2/3 of humanity. It's been called the geographic pivot of history. For over 4 centuries, Eurasia's economic focus has been the maritime passages that surround it. But during ancient times, many of the world's most important trading routes ran overland. Today, regional powers are putting forward competing visions for reconnecting Asia. Roads, railways, and other infrastructure projects could revive overland routes. They could forge new maritime connections, and they could reshape the global economic landscape. The stakes are high. Last century's infrastructure projects fueled development, but also competition and even conflict. Today's efforts could echo well beyond the region.
And the basic reality is that the division of the world into kind of totally separate, autonomous entities and other areas controlled by sometimes foreigners is coming to an end. We are getting one interconnected world.
But critical questions remain about these massive investments. What's driving these projects? Will they connect in an economically meaningful way?
What does that foretell? What does that mean in terms of political ambitions and how people will look at the region differently, and will they behave in a different way?
The Reconnecting Asia project provides new tools for answering these questions, beginning with what's really happening on the ground. Use this interactive website to track the evolution of Asia's infrastructure network at the project level. Explore the who, what, and why behind these megaprojects. See tomorrow's supercontinent through the eyes of regional powers. Make sense of it all with expert analysis that uncovers the trend lines behind today's headlines. This is reconnectingasia.csis.org.
Hello, I'm John Hillman. I'm the director of the Reconnecting Asia project. And you can tell we've got a pretty talented multimedia team. Somehow they were able to put together a video that gets even non-engineers excited about infrastructure. We know it's a technical subject, but we have to remember these are human endeavors, as brave and flawed as the people behind them. And for me, that's where it gets interesting. Look closely at a single project and you can see an architect's creativity, a politician's ambition, an investor's wager, a community's lifeline. Infrastructure projects are not only windows into society, many of them are reshaping society, moving people, goods, data, and ideas faster and further than ever before. That's especially true in Asia, where a new order is emerging, rail by rail, lane by lane. At reconnectingasia.csis.org, you can see new connections stretching across the continent. We've started by tracking over 1,500 roads, railways, and ports. Our website shows you how these projects fit within existing and emerging networks, and it allows you to dive deeper and see what's really happening on the ground. To give you a sense of those capabilities and how the landscape is changing, I'd like to show you 3 projects. The first one is in Central Asia. This is what one stretch of the Chinese-Kazakh border looked like 6 years ago. It's about 90 kilometers away from the nearest major city. Centuries ago, it was a transit point on the Silk Road. Today, those ancient routes could be reawakening. A key part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, this area is now home to a massive industrial zone and logistics center. It's equipped with customs and immigration facilities, cranes for switching containers between different railroad gauges, and dormitories for thousands of workers. Some have said this spot could become the next Dubai if rail transport between Asia and Europe takes off in the coming years. By 2020, they estimate economic activity here will have increased 20-fold, supporting 50,000 jobs. But success is far from assured. Compared to sea freight, rail cuts the travel time between Asia and Europe in half, but it's also 2 to 5 times more expensive. That's one reason why, as Matt mentioned earlier, 90% of today's international trade travels by sea. In the long run, these types of economic factors will determine whether ambitious projects are viable, but the implications extend beyond economics. New patterns of trade, transport, and human activity give way to new political realities. To illustrate, let's look at a second project, this one in Eastern Europe. This is what the Kerch Strait looked like 3 years ago. It occupies a strategic location between Russia and Crimea, and throughout history, many have tried to build across it. The British were the first to do so in 1870 when they laid a telegraph line to India. Germany tried and failed to build a bridge in the 1940s. The Soviet Union succeeded briefly, but the bridge was damaged and deemed too expensive to repair. Recently, that old idea has resurfaced in a powerful way. Here's that same area last month. Russia has committed over $4 billion for the bridge you see being built. According to estimates, it will allow 14 million people to travel between Russia and Crimea each year. It's an ambitious project, not only politically, but also technically. Engineers will need to overcome difficult soil, ice flows, and even seismic activity. Taking those challenges into account, an economic case could be made for simply improving the existing ferry surface. Indeed, travel between Russia and Crimea is heaviest during the summer months. But there would be trade-offs in operating costs, seasonal access, and overall capacity. These are the kinds of practical considerations we're taking into account as we explore what's driving these projects. As this example reminds us, it's clear the continent is changing. Our website tracks those changes, but it also draws attention to areas that aren't changing. Often that's just as interesting. So let's look at one last project, this time in South Asia. This is the site of Bangladesh's largest development project. If you look closely at the middle of the image, you can see some road work leading up to the Padma River. The roads are a part of a bridge project that was started in 2011, and according to one estimate, could boost Bangladesh's GDP by 1.2%. But the project barely got off the ground before evidence of corruption led a number of organizations to withdraw their support. The project has continued with other sources of funding, and officials visiting the site have sought to underscore the work that has been completed. But progress has been slow. This picture was taken just a few weeks ago. The stakes are even higher than they might first appear. The bridge is part of Asian Highway 1, which is intended to stretch all the way from Tokyo to Turkey. In that context, the fate of this bridge will impact not only Bangladesh's economy, but also connectivity throughout the broader region. Truly understanding that impact, however, requires looking both at the project itself as well as the larger network of which it's a part. And that's exactly the type of analysis our platform is designed to enable. In closing, I want to underscore that, as Matt did, we're looking for help with these efforts. Our analysis is only as good as the data behind it. That's why at the bottom of every page on our website, we have a link that says, "Help us improve this site." So if you're someone who's following these developments closely, if your organization works on these issues, or even if you've just been to the region recently and have photos you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. I'll leave it there because there really isn't a better introduction to the website than the website itself. And during the panel discussion, we'll be using it just a little bit to pull up items of interest as they're brought up in the conversation. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panel of experts to the stage. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see, well, mine's working, so hopefully it's all working well. Okay, great. So Thank you, John, and we hope you will explore the site and see some of the other features that are on there that allow you to search for different projects and understand what's going on. But right now, I want to give some context to all this with this terrific panel we have up here. I think you're going to see this is a really great, very interesting group that have a different set of perspectives. You have biographical information, so I'm not going to do detailed introductions, but to my far right, your left, is Aaron Bielenberg, who is Expert Associate Principal at McKinsey & Company and has written extensively on infrastructure investment around the world, and so Aaron, delighted to have you with us. To my immediate right is Elizabeth Wishnick, who is Professor of Political Science at Montclair State University, and she is an expert on China and Russia, and has quite an interesting perspective on their motivations and their activities in this area in infrastructure development. To my left is Johannes Lin, who is non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's a former vice president for Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank, and again, a real expert in infrastructure development in that part of the world, in Central Asia. And to my far left is Wade Shepard, who is a contributor to Forbes magazine, but that doesn't do full justice to what he does. He actually walks the Silk Road. He actually has, for about 15 years, been out in the region following development across China and the broader region, and has a really interesting set of stories. And I encourage you to follow his stories in Forbes. They're really very colorful. You'll get a bit of that here today. With that brief introduction, let me kick this off, and I will bring the audience into the conversation, but let me have a little conversation up here amongst the five of us first. So let me start with Aaron to do a laydown on infrastructure itself, not specifically in Asia, but in general, because I think most of us are not really experts in this area of human endeavor. You wrote in a report on sustainable infrastructure earlier this year that global demand for new infrastructure could total $90 trillion between 2015 and 2030. I'll come back to the sustainable part, but just first, what explains that large number? What does that number mean, and what can be done to begin meeting that or closing that gap?
All right. Well, thanks for having me first, and I look forward to playing with the website for the rest of the evening. It looks like a great tool. I think it's a great initiative. I think just to focus on the gap, I think in the work that we've done, we've decided to use the structure of a gap to really help us understand kind of where we are in developing infrastructure, its impact, and where some of the shortcomings are. While infrastructure tends to be focused on as an area of opportunity, growth, et cetera, it's also probably equally focused on by policymakers, critics, et cetera, as an area of a problematic area that's holding back growth, an area that we need to focus on more distinctly. So the 90 trillion gap is actually was work that we did based on the new climate economy work that really focuses on what it means to effectively build all of our infrastructure going forward in a sustainable manner. And so we can focus in more detail on that, but I think it's an important point in the sense that if we truly want to develop the infrastructure that meets the growth needs, the projected growth needs as anemic as they are today for the next 15 years, and we want to do that in a sustainable fashion, the price tag is obviously enormous, and that's kind of across the full spectrum. So I think, but what actually goes into that, I mean, really, and this is where I think some of this work they're doing is particularly important, is going way back. What's the basis for an infrastructure project? Kind of what is its goal? Is it really trying to meet a defined set of demands? Is it trying to meet a political purpose? How do you, as an investor, as an academic, as a potential EPC contractor, when you're assessing the market, a bankable future, it has a commercial business plan behind it, or whether or not it's just a political boondoggle? And I think that kind of level of sophistication in the market is increasing over time. But a big reason why we're not actually meeting that gap is that throughout the full system, there's challenges. And I'll just kind of quickly go into them. I think from the very beginning, a lot of the projects that we just saw now, I think it's fair to say that we don't know their exact origin always, but they generally don't come from a very rigorous evaluation of where the demand is for that infrastructure service, very rigorous projections as to where that economic benefit is going to occur and who's going to be the recipient of that. I mean, infrastructure as an economic development tool is proven. Essentially a 20% multiplier effect for every dollar spent in infrastructure, 20 cents of GDP almost directly goes in. The kind of jobs implication, particularly in the emerging markets for mega projects and large infrastructure is proven and is quite significant. So there is, while there's evidence for the economic benefit, that doesn't apply to every project. There are good projects and there are bad projects. So I think the first challenge we see in actually meeting these gaps is very much about project selection and about identifying that process. And then we find, obviously across governments, there isn't a uniform capability set in delivering that. So we did an initial study about 5 years ago looking at this infrastructure gap. Our number was smaller than that because it wasn't kind of focused on sustainability, but we recut those numbers over the past year and found that actually, despite the financial crisis, despite what you would see as a need to improve the economy, stimulate growth, the public investment in infrastructure has actually declined in most of the OECD, with the general exception being that Asia, particularly India and China and Japan, have used as infrastructure spending as a policy tool. So in many ways, there's a bit of a dichotomy that we're seeing in the world, is that the recognition of the role of infrastructure and stimulus has been picked up by the Asian countries, but hasn't actually been by the OECD. So just, I think, kind of on my last point on the gap is there's quite a bit of conversations ongoing about the meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and some of the COP21 discussions about raising private capital to invest in infrastructure. There is obviously no shortage of private capital in kind of this world where pools of capital are seeking yield. Infrastructure has become a theme that they're focused on. And so the real issue kind of in the market in meeting this gap is, we can go into complexity of that, and it is complex, is how do you match these pools of capital with projects? And so in a political environment where projects are generally developed to meet political needs, to meet perceived views of the economy as opposed to real demand drivers, then there consequently isn't that many bankable projects. So I think that's kind of the challenge.
Great, excellent overview of the subject. A couple of things I want to follow up on, but let me bring Johannes into the conversation because you have worked extensively at the World Bank on infrastructure finance. And before we talk about Eurasia specifically, although you can feel free to bring that in, just more broadly, what is the link between infrastructure and development? What is the sort of conceptual way to think about how infrastructure contributes or doesn't to development?
Thanks, Matt. I also want to congratulate you for your website. One feature which when you showed it to us earlier, is actually terrific, is the search function. So if you look for a particular project, if you look for a particular country, a border crossing, or an institution, you can just put it in there and it'll pop up with the projects that are most relevant. So that's terrific. As I mentioned, the big challenge will be to keep this thing up to date. And so anybody in this room who is willing to financially support CSIS, and I come from Brookings.
Didn't ask him to say
I
that.
come from Brookings, so it's the competition, but it's so darn promising that, I think for anybody working on these issues of intra-continental integration, I think it's going to be a terrific resource. So good luck with it, but also especially good luck with finding funding for maintaining it for the next 5-10 years and building on it. So what is the connection? I'm a great fan of, obviously, coming from where I am, for infrastructure investments. That's been the bread and butter to some extent of the World Bank and other organizations I've worked with, Asian Development Bank and so on, over the last few years. But I also think in order to actually have a development impact from this investment, you better be aware that actually the physical engineering part of it, building the bridge, even though it can be very complicated, as we heard, and from an engineering point of view, complex, the physical project design and even, if you wish, implementation, building the darn thing, or building a road, or building a railroad, is actually relatively simple compared to all the rest that has to be done to have actually the infrastructure services being delivered with this asset, the physical asset you create. So there are what I call hard infrastructure issues and soft infrastructure, and I won't bore you with a lot of detail here, but I think it's useful just to run down some of these issues. So first of all, especially for infrastructure that is sort of cross-border and maybe even region and continent-wide, you really have to have a system approach to it. It isn't good enough to just look at one road or one railroad. You really have to look at the various systemic aspects of the roads and the railroads and the water, whatever, air interconnecting. So you have to have a system-wide approach. Because if there's one bottleneck in one place along a corridor, transport corridor, you can fix that, but then there'll be another bottleneck, and that bottleneck will actually determine the maximum speed with which you can transit, so system-wide. Secondly, you tend to have sort of separate approaches to region-wide, regional institution, regional planning, and national planning, and those plans don't necessarily mesh. You have, one minister in a regional organization will sign on to some regional corridors, but then domestically something else will be done. The whole issue of financing, of course, is critical. Public-private partnerships are the great idea. It's not that easy. It takes time. And of course, private funding for some of these, particularly if they're more politically dominated infrastructure investments, won't be there. Well, then you say, okay, the Chinese will fund it. Well, that's great. But, the Chinese don't give the money away. They make loans. So is the Tajikistan able to actually carry that loan and repay that loan? Venezuela. Look at what happened. Right now, the Chinese are struggling to actually get their money back, and probably most of it will be lost. Tajikistan suffered from a major debt crisis, infrastructure investment going to basically rekindle a debt crisis for a number of these poorer countries. So that's something to bear in mind. And finally, and from my perspective, perhaps the most important is let's not neglect operations and maintenance, especially maintenance. Think about metro. So, metro here in this country fails substantially today because it wasn't properly maintained. Well, now think about Tajikistan or whatever, Kyrgyzstan or whatever country. Even think about China. All that investment in infrastructure has taken place, and it's huge. 20, 30 years ago, from now, will they have the same problem this country now has with its very fundamentally decaying infrastructure and unable or unwilling, as in this country, to actually maintain it? So critical. Now, time's constrained, so let me talk for a moment, though, about soft infrastructure. So if you go today, or at least when maybe 5 years ago, last time, went by car from Uzbekistan to Tajikistan, I came to the border. It was a main road connecting Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. At 8 o'clock in the morning, we actually had to wake up the border guard to literally unlock the gate so one could eventually drive through. Now, that's an extreme case. But the point about border crossings, when you have integration across continental space, border crossings are a huge barrier that need to be addressed. And across the entire Eurasian space, this is a problem. You need to, of course, also harmonized energy. If you, talk about electricity networks, you need harmonized energy regulation. But it isn't not just what are the borders, also behind the borders. So when you take a cab, as I did again a few years ago from Kyrgyzstan to Kazakhstan, the capitals, you actually find the cab stops about every 10 miles because you have policemen stopping it and taking a bribe. Now that takes time and it takes creates costs. And these kind of costs, they may seem small, but actually they add up and provide major barriers to sort of cross-continental international travel. Logistics, links, and very important links to the local economy. Now here's the interesting part. So we're thinking about these transit networks across Asia and Eurasia, but it's quite possible that actually local communities around and along behind those won't benefit much. I'm thinking about Oaxaca in Mexico when the Panamericana highway was built. Well, along the highway there was flower sellers and so on, but you went maybe 5-10 miles behind and there was virtually no impact. So somehow or other, the countries actually, in China really I think has to pay attention to that. When it now supports these networks, it also has to support the secondary and tertiary connectivity investments that have to go with it for actually not only the Chinese construction crew benefiting in a sense from this, and the transit traffic, but also local communities. Without that, frankly, over the long term, I don't think many of the economic benefits, but also for China, many of the political benefits won't materialize. Thank you.
Excellent. Again, you've touched on a lot of things that I want to follow up on, including with other panelists, because like PPPs and this question of soft infrastructure, which is very important. But let me pull Liz into the conversation and ask about, pull this into Asia and the specific context we're looking at here. This project is not just about China and the Belt and Road Initiative, but obviously one of the main participants in this activity and one of the drivers of this conversation is China, and they have this Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes called One Belt and One Road, central pillar of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. But Wade, for example, I'm going to bring in a second, recently wrote a piece that the New Silk Road idea has been around for 10 or 15 years at least, and it isn't even really just a Chinese idea. It's kind of, there are a lot of international players in this story. So what is new and different about OBOR?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here at this launch. And I think when the audience has a chance to look at the website, they'll see that there are so many different concepts from different perspectives of how to connect to Asia. You see not just China's OBOR plan, but you also see Japan's view, India's view, Russia's view, Kazakhstan's view. So there are multiple ways to connect to Asia or reconnect to Asia. And so from the Chinese point of view, I would agree with Wade's point that some of this we've seen before. In 1999, the Chinese government launched the Go West policy as a way of developing China's western regions and anchoring it into the newly independent Central Asian states. We've seen China try to develop cross-border trade and invest in Pakistan, and that also predated the OBOR policy. We've seen Chinese localities try to develop cross-border partnerships with localities across the border from them. So, and certainly the Russia-China piece of this, because Russia and China share such a long border, has been an enduring challenge for that partnership. And I also had a cross-border experience, having taken a bus from Vladivostok to Hunchun in China, and this was in the early 2000s when the roads weren't very well paved on the Russian side, and by comparison, Hunchun was so much more developed. I think there's been a lot of progress in many dimensions in infrastructure development, but I think what's new about the Chinese OBOR plan is not so much what's happening in the immediate neighborhood in Central Asia and South Asia and Russia. I think what's new is what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Because I think that there's a realistic appreciation of all the difficulties that my colleagues have raised in terms of developing new infrastructure, and a sense that China has excess capacity, it has investment funds, it wants to expand trade, it wants to shorten its trade routes from between Asia and Europe, and the best way to do this is to find beachheads in Southern Europe. And so one project that I've been looking at with interest is the Chinese company Costco's acquisition of a 67% stake in the Greek port of Piraeus, which the Chinese ambassador to Greece called the dragon head of the OBOR plan, because it could be the endpoint for this Silk Road that would travel along various routes, either by land or by sea. By sea, it could go down the Indian Ocean, up the Suez Canal, and then to Greece, and then connect with other Chinese investments in Europe. And so China has been active in promoting the 16+1 plan to try to bring together European countries within the EU and without to build new rail connections as a way of facilitating these new port investments. Piraeus is just one. I think China's been looking more broadly in the Mediterranean region in North Africa, trying to develop ports there and improve transportation links. So to my mind, that's a new aspect that I don't think we pay enough attention to that there's a European dimension to this Asian reconnection. And then the other piece the two other pieces I think are interesting. One is the changing Russian attitude towards Chinese obor, which previously was one of caution, fear, and competition with the Eurasian Economic Union, and in the last year or two, finding more commonalities. And then also the security implications of China's interest in Southern Europe in terms of developing the naval base in Djibouti, for example, exercises with Russia in the Mediterranean. So I do think there are some security consequences to pay attention to as well.
Is that what you meant by the greater commonalities between Russia and China, particularly in that sort of security dimension? Or do you mean even in the sort of economic connections that are being made along the border or through Kazakhstan or whatever?
Well, I think Chinese localities have been striving to find partners wherever they are, and one new Silk Road partner for China is the Arctic, the Russian Arctic. So the Silk Road Fund invested in the Yamal gas project in Russia's Arctic. So that's the first Silk Road investment in Russia, 9.9% stake, so over $1 billion. And that enabled the Novatech company to circumvent sanctions and to proceed with that project. And other Chinese banks also stepped in to invest in that project. So I think Russia needs Chinese investment. They realize that. Xi Jinping and President Putin met a year ago to discuss ways of working together in their two projects, and we haven't really seen much concrete steps so far, apart from this Yamal investment.
Interesting. Speaking of the Arctic, we have a great program on the Arctic here run by my colleague Heather Conley, and I urge you to check out our website on that as well, because it's a great story. Wade, I don't know if you've been to the Arctic, but you've been over a long part of the OBOR sort of expansive network, and tell us a story about something interesting you've seen, because you said your story was extreme, but he told us a story earlier that sounded even more extreme about the customs and border issues. You don't have to tell that story if you don't want here, but I mean, what's going on, and what are you seeing?
One of the things that I'm told almost everywhere I go, almost every station of this new Silk Road, Belt and Road, whatever you want to call it, is I'm meeting with people, I'm going and visiting their projects and talking with government officials, and one thing people always tell me is, 5 years ago there was nothing here. 2 years ago, there was nothing. We're starting this up from at the ground up. There was nothing here before. And we're essentially going out to these nodes on this network and kind of like creating not only a trade hub, not only a logistics center, but trying to build an entirely new economy along this network of like many other nodes, many other cities, many other countries who are trying to build complementary new economies. And what we're looking at is isn't just trade routes, but a massive paradigm shift, or an attempt at a massive paradigm shift as countries from China all the way to Europe, or Eastern Europe especially, kind of transition into something that they're not currently right now. Oil and gas rich countries, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. Azerbaijan has about 30 years of oil left, apparently. These countries are shaking in their boots with a low cost of oil. That's their economic lifeblood. So you kind of see these countries kind of scampering to create something new, to create a new impetus to kind of drive their economic wheels. And this transit corridors, logistic corridors, or manufacturing and assembly sites along this massive new trade network from China to Europe is what they see as the future of their country. And as I said, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, they don't really have much else. So when you kind of look at the economic sense or the economic rationale of a lot of these projects, I mean, one of the things that you kind of have to keep in mind is that these places are going to change. 5 years from now, they're going to look drastically different. 10 years from now, they're going to look as different as what they did 5 years ago when there was nothing there. So at the time I started going out and traveling these routes was around 2013. And I got to see like many of these projects kind of like grow up from nothing, grow up into right now, I mean, the first wave of this network is creating the infrastructure, creating the logistics hubs, creating the capacity and the ability to ship products. This is only the first wave of this project. And you can kind of see this network coming together. Baku has the new port of Baku. Kazakhstan has Korgos Gateway and Aktau on the other side. Poland has Mala logistics zone and Tiraspol municipality. And you go out there and you look at these places now and it's like, yeah, you have this logistical network that's almost set up and almost ready, almost in place. But that's just the start of the plan. After they get these trains going, after they get these trucks going, after they get the highways built, after they get the rail networks, the political parts of it kind of solidified, then they're going to start, becoming manufacturing areas, assembly zones, and kind of create this new economy based off of this infrastructure and transportation network. And just seeing this happen, seeing the initial stages of it, and just how much these countries are invested into this, how much of their future is dependent on it, has been absolutely fascinating. But like I said before, it's not just building new infrastructure, but it's an absolute complete paradigm shift. We're also talking about countries that kind of have the old Soviet mentality, kind of top government heavy ideals of doing business and kind of running the country. So you see a lot of countries with identity crises or trying to change like who they are and the way they do things, as at the same time they're creating this capacity to engage other countries in a way that's kind of creating a new model for business and logistics and then politics across the entire Eurasian region.
Can I ask, and maybe if the guys could put up the picture of Korgos, of the dry port there. You and I have both been to Korgos. I was there in May, and you just wrote a piece about it. So there, that picture there, with my most flattering side there in the picture, shows that the challenge here is that the Soviet/Russian gauge on the rail is wider than the Chinese gauge. So the Chinese track is on the left and the Kazakh gauge is on the right, and so you have to get the goods from one track to the other, and you can either lift the train and widen the gauge, or you can use these seaport cranes to move the containers themselves from one train to the other, and that's what they're trying to do here. This is a project sponsored by the Kazakh Railway, but run by Dubai Ports, interestingly, so it really is international. You were there. What's your kind of take on this project and whether it's actually going to, in theory, it's going to make stuff move faster, more efficiently. There's a warehousing area and a manufacturing area near here, so you can, in theory, manage your if you're a Chinese exporter, manage your inventory quite efficiently through this thing. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it took 6 hours to get down there by a bumpy road from Almaty, and it's really the middle of, if there is a middle of nowhere, that's pretty close to it. Yeah. And so I'm sort of wondering how much, see there are no trains in the picture, how much activity is going to be going through there, and what would determine what will and what won't happen there.
The whole idea here is to take these places, like as you said, are the middle of nowhere and transitioning them into being the center of the world, right? Center of the continent, you can either view Korgos Gateway as, pretty much being very, very, very located very near the furthest point, like on the planet from an ocean. That's like the definition of remote. But it's also the center of the continent, right? So the ideal here is to say, hey, we can have this massive logistics hub here that we can run trains from China. We can take them all the way to Europe. We can break the trains apart, send them down to Afghanistan, send them down to Pakistan, send them to Iran, send trains all the way up from Iran here, assemble them, send them to Europe. And basically the whole idea is to create this massive hub in the middle where the entire Eurasian region can kind of meet in the middle of nowhere, in the center of the world, and kind of do business. It's kind of like almost like neutral ground in between kind of two massive economic powerhouses on both sides of Eurasia, and that's the point in the middle where they meet. And that place is also very interesting because on the other side of the border, on the Chinese side, is the city of Korgos. And there you have, that's a typical Chinese new city building project. The place was just commissioned as a city 2 years ago. And it's like transitioning from being like this remote agricultural, like very sparsely populated backwater area into like this new city that's the size of New York City, and massive amounts of investments going in there. The high-rises are being built, the trade centers are being built, and basically the whole idea is, hey, we're going to meet in the middle at this point, and this is where we're going to come and exchange goods, kind of like during the days of the fabled Silk Road.
And we'll see. I mean, let me actually ask Aaron about this. I mean, what would make that work or not work in your experience? I mean, what makes sort of an infrastructure project create not sustainable in the way, sustained economic activity in an area, and where does it turn back into the, sort of the dust, because you have examples. The Transcontinental Railroad, if you in the U.S., you see, cities along there that were developed because of the railway, but you also see ghost towns and where economic activity may have been there at one point but disappeared. Have you looked at that sort of question of what actually determines, and you alluded to this as well, Johannes, what determines whether economic activity actually sticks along this infrastructure?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think just listening to Wade, I think the example that pops into a lot of people's minds probably is Dubai and the success of Dubai as a hub coming from nowhere. And I think that's actually, in an interesting way, been an inspiration for a lot of the country planners, central planners, et cetera. And I think, so breaking down maybe some of their recipes for success and also challenges is interesting, one way to do it. I mean, I think ultimately especially for mega projects, the single project focus becomes very challenging because there's so many interdependencies on the macroeconomic situation. They tend to require intermodal links, commercial players on both sides of the infrastructure, both kind of the input, the output. And so you need to have at the very core a coordinating function, and that has to be sitting in the context of something that actually works together. And so, going back to the example of Dubai, it truly does have to be generally a functional state with a high level of capability that has the ability to coordinate both the regulatory framework as well as some of the state-owned entity players involved. And that kind of core coordination, often centered in a relatively small group of leaders who are committed to a set of goals which can be clearly articulated, tends to be the pattern where things work and where things don't. From the economic perspective, you need to actually be able to capture the benefits of the infrastructure through the system. So, and we're seeing this become a solution even in the US and other places where, in some ways, the infrastructure service itself is not a profitable service. It's the value related to the land surrounding it. It's a value related to the transactions, the revenue that may not even be tax revenue from the government that actually accrues to the owner of that system, that coordinated system. And so if you aren't able to capture that and then have the ability to influence kind of the increase and improvement of those different revenue streams, then you're just not in a position to benefit or effectively maintain or develop the project. And I think the last thing which a lot of the grand planners in some of the countries that we're looking at refer to is absent, is that you truly do need to have a commitment to transparency, to free borders, to reducing transaction costs for goods and people and ideas. And the only way that you're going to be able to attract the high level of capability that's actually required to get these projects done and to put them in place very practically is by getting people that are good, that you want to live where you're building and to stay there. And if you don't have a system both from a cultural, socioeconomic, or political regulatory framework that allows for that, then it becomes very challenging to be successful.
Interesting. I want to talk about the private sector's sort of role in all of this, because most infrastructure is funded, publicly, but the private sector potentially could be a major, financier, and there's lots of money around the world looking for long-term returns, decent long-term returns. So, in theory, these sorts of investments would be a big opportunity. Presumably, it's not coming in, or when it isn't coming in, it's because there are all these uncertainties and questions about whether the project, is bankable, whether it's going to generate a long-term return. But Johannes, you mentioned PPP, and Aaron, you can comment on this too. What is the best way to mobilize the private sector in this activity? Is it PPP, and what's wrong with, you alluded to the fact that PPP was more challenging than it sounds?
Well, it depends very much on the sector that we're talking about. So if we're talking about pipelines, whether it's the pipeline from Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey. I mean, a lot of that was funded by private sources with support from EBRD and IFC. So usually it's you need both, but meaning you need the international funding from the international development agencies as well as, but you can also attract quite a lot of private funding for those kind of investments. For these particularly the transnational road investments, my hunch is that from at least what I've seen, there's very little, say, if you go from China over to Europe, very little that, in terms of the larger structures that can be funded from private sources. Now, when you get to Europe and you get into Eastern Europe and you get into toll roads, for example, highways that can be funded by tolls, yes, there are bits and pieces where the private sector can come in. Some of them, by the way, in Hungary, as I recall, have not been all that successful. So they're never easy. These public-private funding packages, putting them together is not a silver bullet. It has to be carefully designed. It takes time, and sometimes they don't work out. So there are no silver bullet. Very important for the ultimate success of private sector involvement is two factors. One, of course, security. So if you're trying to figure out what to do about the belt of insecurity from the Middle East over to even Myanmar or whatever, the private sector very likely will not go in. Energy, maybe, if it's properly supported by the international community and by national government security efforts. But in the road area, I would think that's very little the case. The key issue is sort of getting private sector involvement is, of course, the national quality of business climate. If the business climate in your country is very poor, chances are you'll have a much harder time attracting private sector investment of any kind, but including and especially in infrastructure. So I think those are sort of some of the considerations I'd throw out. It's always good to keep that in mind. By the way, private sector involvement will sort of help making sure, at least up to a point, that the projects are actually bankable and have a ultimately financial payoff that more politically public sector dominated projects very often don't have.
Did you want to comment on the private
I think just quickly on I think what you alluded to in the global landscape, PPPs only make up 5 to 10% of total projects, and so while it's an important contributor to catalyze the involvement of private capital and deliver infrastructure, it's not going to become the dominant play. That public sector investment is still the kind of 80%. And I just mentioned there's a tremendous kind of need to make that capital more efficient from the public sector, to make that delivery more efficient. I think on the private sector, most infrastructure investment from the private sector is actually not pure financial. It's corporate, and so the kind of set of requirements to make a corporate comfortable to invest are essentially what we just laid out. I think where the financial kind of opportunities can come in, and where there's significant opportunities is again to the point that I mentioned earlier, is that there really needs to be a lot more commitment to encapsulating the clear revenue drivers for some of these projects, for actually doing the work ahead of time to put those in place, to work those out politically. We've seen a lot of potentially good toll road projects not work because politically tolls were not acceptable, right? But then we've seen a lot of very complicated real estate value capture projects that actually can get projects done by giving the public sector an interest in real estate as well as revenue streams work. So there's a lot of innovation going on now in how to capture the revenue streams. But I think it's fair to say that in most of these markets, roads and rail may not be directly bankable if they're continued to be pushed forward as single projects with single revenue streams.
Interesting. Well, I had a follow-up, but I want to get the audience in, because we have sort of limited time before the main event, Dr. Hamre and Dr. Brzezinski. But in fact, I'm going to ask Elizabeth one more question about this security question, because we all have, it sounds like, a border crossing story, because I, 30 years ago, took the Trans-Siberian Railway and crossed from China directly into Russia. Or Soviet Union. We didn't go through Mongolia. And, and I was mentioning earlier that there were sort of jackbooted, blonde Soviet guards on the Soviet side, and it just sort of, it was 30 years ago, but still, it brought home to me how challenging it's going to be along, that border, but also, more broadly in the region to do this kind of thing. I mean, how much does security factor into your assessment of whether OBOR or Russian plans or other visions are actually going to be fulfilled here?
Well, I think in the immediate neighborhood, if you look at the Central Asia, South Asia, security is an important aspect of it. If you take the China-Pakistan economic corridor, for example, Pakistan created a new force of 15,000 people to guard 7,000 Chinese workers. So that doesn't seem very sustainable if you have a 2-to-1 ratio of security personnel to workers. And there are still attacks that happen regularly in that area. And so China has big plans for investments in road and the port of Gwadar and so forth. And partly this is to make sure that Xinjiang remains a stable place. But all of this is connected to what happens in Afghanistan in the future, which is, Afghanistan is not an integral component of this. If Afghanistan is a black hole in the middle of OBOR, then I don't see how the rest of it is going to be workable. And so also Indian Ocean issues, piracy. I think there are a lot of different kinds of security threats. The situation in Libya, which already led China to evacuate 30,000 people a few years ago. So there are plenty of security issues that have the potential to interrupt this. And for China, I think OBOR is a series of bilateral agreements where it seems like a big multilateral project, but it's a series of bilateral pieces, and China negotiates separately with different governments about different types of issues. And so I think the security issues come up in these kinds of contexts, and China seems to try to resolve them on that basis.
Right. Your mention of Afghanistan reminds me that we haven't talked about sort of U.S. involvement in this and stakes in this. The U.S. we don't have a competing visions map. You saw the China vision up there briefly. We have, when you go to the website, you'll see we have 6 of the players with this sort of impressionistic map of their vision: India, Japan, Korea, Russia, Turkey, I think, is the 6th. And the U.S. has had this new Silk Fund or New Silk Road project in Afghanistan, which was mostly about sort of serving the, our military capability there. But that's a big question that maybe we can, in the Q&A, elicit a little bit. Maybe somebody will ask about that. But what the U.S. stake in all this is, I think there's a big one, personally, in terms of commercial interest, but also strategic interest. And just to give one example, as I think we all in this room know, the president of the Philippines has been in China this week, and has said some interesting things about his country's relationship with China and the United States. And I happen to have a fellow scholar who was staying in the same hotel as the Philippines delegation, ran into some of the Philippine participants, and they said this is all about infrastructure. It's because China is going to fund roads and railroads in the Philippines, and that's what they want. So if the U.S. doesn't get that, then they're missing something significant about this story. So just to kind of try and tie in that piece as well. And I will bring the audience to just wait any stories that sort of elicit this, any of what I was just talking about, or the security-related dimensions of all this as well.
That's really tough. I mean, China seems to have this ideal of combating security issues with economic development. You kind of seen them do it with the Western region. I mean, they're trying hard to do it in Xinjiang right now, but it's still too early to tell how well this would work. But I mean, more in the Western regions, some of the economically unbalanced regions. The whole idea is that you can stabilize unrest with economic development and infrastructure. Not only does this infrastructure create opportunities, but it creates better access to these regions, which gives governments better control of these areas. Now, how well this will work in Pakistan or Afghanistan, I mean, I have no idea.
Have you been
that's
down
way
that corridor?
down.
Have you been down that corridor, the Pakistan?
I've only been at the top, but I haven't traveled down that one yet. But that said, a lot of these plans aren't really meant to start showing returns till 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. This is very, very long-term planning. And I think the ideal behind it is that a lot of these issues that we have now can be worked out by then. And kind of like working towards this interconnectivity, intercooperation between governments and different people is one of the best ways to go to kind of like ease these security concerns rather than sending in militaries to kind of subordinate people or take control of people, which hasn't really worked. Now, whether this, I don't know if you'd even call it a Chinese model, whether this model will work or not remains to be seen. But they do have Pakistan on board because they want the money. You know, they have kind of this like carrot dangling from a stick, right? If you can secure these areas, we're going to invest in your infrastructure. We're gonna, invest in your country. We will give you what you want that pretty much no other country can give you. And that kind of creates this incentive to kind of make things more secure at the upper levels of government because, basically they're giving them what they want, but they need to be able to protect it.
Okay, great. Well, lots more to talk about, but I want to invite the audience to ask questions if you have them. Could we turn the house lights up a little bit because it's going to be a little hard to recognize people. There are microphones, so please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself and then please ask a question. So in the front row, I have a gentleman here who has a question. Do we have microphones ready? Can you bring it forward, please? To this gentleman.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I just want to follow what Matt mentioned. I mean, given the domestic, infrastructure challenges in the U.S., which Dr. Ling mentioned, which really is a campaign issue this year, I mean, is it still possible for us to expect sort of enthusiasm from the U.S. government to invest in that region? And if not investing physically, could we expect the U.S. government, rhetorically at least, to show support for things like China's One Belt, One Road initiative? I mean, it's often being seen here in the U.S. as sort of a geopolitical maneuvering, like the U.S. viewed the AIB at the beginning. Even the U.S. government has sort of improved its rhetoric on AIB. It still hasn't shown sort of the enthusiasm like other U.S. allies, in Europe, Australia, South Korea. So could we expect, what should we expect from the U.S. government? Thank you. Okay,
I don't know who wants to try to answer that. Maybe I'm the person who can best answer that, or try to. I think you make some good points. I think that the U.S. has an enormous infrastructure challenge of its own, and that's probably going to be the primary focus of the new administration in the short term. And it's true that this part of the world is sort of on some level far away, and we don't have the same kind of. Theoretically we have the money, but we don't choose, I think, normally to spend money on things or announce $200 billion initiatives in Asia or anywhere else. So we're unlikely to do that. But what the U.S. does have great companies that have an interest in this set of developments, and are already, many of them, participating, but have an opportunity to participate, including, you mentioned the AIB, which is open, in theory, even to companies not from member countries. So I think there's a commercial stake there, clearly. But these companies, if you think about what Americans bring to the table, we bring good quality ability to invest in this sort of activity. We bring sort of our standards, our rule of law, the other practices that we just naturally bring to our business practices and to the government policies behind that. So I think the U.S. has, and we have a stake, because if, beyond the commercial, if bridges are built that fall down or that destroy the environment or that dislocate tens of thousands of people or create security problems, the U.S. is going to end up getting involved in those things in one way or another. So I think that the stakes are quite broad and significant. I agree it's going to be hard to get people to focus on how to participate, but we have some ideas from this. And just to advertise another project that we're working on, we've got an Asia Economic Strategy Commission chaired by Charlene Barshevsky, Evan Greenberg, and John Huntsman, which will be issuing a report next month, November 30th. Mark your calendars. We'll be publishing that, and one of our top line recommendations is to give the new administration some specific ideas about how to focus on infrastructure in Asia. So stay tuned for that. Just to give you that little teaser. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything
just
about
quickly,
this.
I think it's a great point. I think there's a couple observations. One is that some of both the European as well as the Asian companies have been very successful at winning bids either on construction, O&M, or financial abroad because they created efficiencies, expertise at home, right? So I think in some ways the best thing that U.S. Government can do is actually spark and fund and be innovative in U.S. infrastructure and allow some of these companies to grow internally and build the capacity. The other thing that some of these countries do very well is they pair their export bank financing, their commercial bank financing very closely with their infrastructure bidders. And they also pair pension capital, et cetera. So they essentially come to a set of projects with a fully banked solution. And that's something that we don't do as well. That having been said, I think some of the lessons from President Obama's focus on Africa and Power Africa, the coordinating function that the U.S. government can play to bring investors, development agencies, as well as the private sector to do that has been one that could be relevant for Asia. I think we've done that in many other ways in Asia too. So I think, but bringing that as a focus of both, how do you build your internal infrastructure demand to boost your local companies, as well as create a more streamlined go-to-market kind of fully packaged solution for
Great,
Asia.
Thanks. Johannes, you had a quick...
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been watching this question about how much of an interest is there in the United States to actually engage in a serious way in the Eurasian integration process, and particular sort of the Central Asian and Caucasus countries. And my sense always has been there's not a strong national interest in putting a lot of money, of your own taxpayer money, in that region. Now, if you think about Mrs. Clinton's Silk Road initiative that she actually brought into being while she was Secretary of State, that relied not on U.S. funding. It most relied on funding by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and it was not, in that sense, a U.S. financed initiative. Of course, it didn't go very far either because it didn't have a lot of priority with considering other initiatives. Now, looking ahead, my sense is that will continue in the sense that not a lot of U.S. aid taxpayer money will go in. However, actually, that idea of Mrs. Clinton's of sort of engaging and making sure, as far as the U.S. can, that the World Bank and ADB and so on are fully engaged, now together with and in partnership with AIB, I think is the way to go. The only problem is that there's a capital increase under consideration for the World Bank and IFC, and it's not clear the U.S. will support this, which will basically mean that the World Bank won't have, and it is, to some extent, so people criticize it, a U.S.-dominated institution. Well, the point is, if you're not even willing to finance the instrument that you have to go in and support in a cooperative way and a multilateral way, then you're really losing the game here. And so I would say, if the U.S. is interested in that region and wants to support, do it in the right way, go the multilateral way, which was Mrs. Clinton's idea, but then actually make sure those instruments of multilateralism that you are engaged in actually have the money to do it.
Great point, and I should have mentioned the MDVs are a huge source of leverage for the U.S. still, and all we need is a new dawn of bipartisan harmony in Washington, and we'll be able to do all those good things, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to. Okay, other questions? And this time maybe I'll take 2 or 3 at once. That gentleman, and then that gentleman there, and then the lady right behind. In fact, just hand it back to her, and then I'll go to you, sir.
Hi, thank you. I heard you guys talk about the security dimensions in this project, and my question is, a lot of the projects being completed here are done by Chinese state-owned companies, which, if you're the FT this morning, they've kind of been taking a hit in their use for non-market purposes. And again, in Cambodia recently, during the ASEAN meeting, Cambodia blocked the bringing up of a Hague Tribunal ruling. And as you can see in your map, there's a ton of activity in Cambodia undertaken by China, a lot of it, most of it by these SOEs. And is there a worry that this heavy Chinese involvement could be used to limit the political freedom of action by many of these poorer countries in the region? And is there a way U.S. policymakers can combat this in any way, or does the U.S. have any further interest in the region to prevent
great,
such
great
activities.
question. Can you just hand the microphone back to the lady behind you? Thanks.
My question is somewhat related. I'm a journalist in Southeast Asia. I was curious as to whether the panel had some comments on Japan's vision. We saw it briefly on the website for basically in the region, and yeah, some general thoughts on this, especially in regards to the trade diplomacy efforts we've been seeing recently in Southeast Asia.
Got it. Okay, and then there was a gentleman over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm from China's OBO Center, CIS. I'm studying at the Georgetown University. The U.S. government already raised the New Silk Road strategy in 2009, which mainly focusing on the Central Asia. So, what's the relationship between Reconnecting Asia and the New Silk Road strategy? As the Chinese government already expressed the welcome for the U.S. to cooperate with China in OBO, so will this newly established organization try to seek cooperation with China? Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have a question about, maybe to you, Liz, about China using this infrastructure investment as a means of, gaining diplomatic or leverage with neighboring countries. Is that what this is partly about, and is this happening in your view?
Well, I think the goal is partly soft power to improve China's image in the neighboring countries. How that actually plays out is another matter, as your question asks. And I think that's always been a challenge in its partnerships with especially smaller countries on its borders, how to provide investment funds and work with the partner country without importing the Chinese model to that country in terms of large-scale dam projects or other types of approaches that perhaps don't even work so well inside China. So I think that's a trend that we're going to have to see how it plays out. I think the Chinese government doesn't always pay attention to the unintended consequences of what seem to be mutually beneficial projects. So that's something definitely to watch, to see whether this does succeed in improving China's soft power in the region, what impact it has on smaller countries or even larger countries. I think Russia is also very sensitive to how China approaches joint development projects.
Did anybody else want to comment on that or on either the other two questions?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times what you're seeing in a lot of the smaller countries, these are countries that were once, like part of the Soviet Union or politically dominated formerly by another big global power. You see them kind of playing out these multi-vector policies where they kind of balance these big global powers kind of against each other. And kind of make them compete with each other within the kind of battlefields of their own country. And essentially they get like, Japan and like, well, in the case of Bangladesh, they had India, Japan, and China competing to build them a deep sea port, right? And they kind of like balance out these various influences to kind of get more investment and kind of like more economic, get their economic balls rolling a little bit more than what they could if they were unilaterally aligned with, say, India, or unilaterally aligned with China or just Russia alone. Instead, they get like multiple countries competing to invest and engage their country.
Mm-hmm. Did you see Japan a lot in Central Asia when you were working there? I have some thoughts on that, but I wondered whether, what's your sense of Japan's
Well, there is
interest
a
in
Japan Central Asia forum that meets, I think, every year or 2 years at the senior minister level. But I'm not into sort of great the details, and certainly not Southeast Asia. So
I don't know
you want to address that.
if we can get Japan's vision up there, but you'll see that it's largely, this is sort of our interpretation of the Japan vision, which is largely focused on Southeast Asia. Japan's been investing in Southeast Asia for many years, initially to support its supply chains across the region, but now as a kind of part of a policy of development across the region. And and Prime Minister Abe has announced a plan called the Quality Infrastructure Initiative, which is a $200 billion plan to facilitate and further invest, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also, as that map, it's hard to see here, but shows that there's also an interest, a lot of diplomatic engagement and increasing interest in Central Asia as well. And Japan's point, and the reason they say quality infrastructure, is that Japan focuses on the long-term sustainability of investment, the long-term life cycle value of this investment, and I think it's not unintended to evoke a difference with the way other people are perhaps approaching this investment. I think it is partly a competitive issue for Japan, but it's also, I think, the track record for Japan on investment both at home and in the region has been that they provide high quality investment, and so they're trying to put their best foot forward in all of this. But they're a major player in this story, and we'll certainly be looking at them, particularly with help from our partner Nikkei. So yes, do you want to add something?
On this point, I think Japan is interested in the energy aspect, especially after Fukushima, improving access to energy and mineral investments, and also counterbalancing China in the region. And there's one colleague of mine in Japan had an idea for an SCO +3. Professor Iwashida from Sapporo is bringing in not just Japan, but the EU and the US as a kind of dialogue partner of the SCO to bring in outside viewpoints to influence the direction there.
On the third question, just very quickly, and then I'll take one or two more questions, just about the US and China cooperation. I'm not sure the New Silk Fund or the New Silk Road initiative of Secretary Clinton is really the basis for a substantial amount of additional cooperation. But more broadly, there are a lot of things the US and China can do together in this area. The MDBs is one example, whether the World Bank, ADB, or in collaboration with the AIIB, even if the US isn't a member, it can encourage collaboration. There are a lot of issues to work on in terms of standards and safeguards in infrastructure investment that can be done through those MDB channels, through the G20, which has put a lot of focus on infrastructure. China hosted the G20 this year, and that was a major topic of infrastructure investment and how to roll out more and better infrastructure investment across the region and the world. So I think there are a number of ways in which the U.S. and China can cooperate, and that's among the things that we're going to be exploring in this project. We really are running out of time, but just maybe one or two burning questions. I'm getting the hook here, I'm told. I shouldn't allow further questions. Okay. So we are, let me first ask you all to join me in thanking the panelists for some terrific thoughts and contributions. Thank you all. Thank you. This is a conversation we're going to continue not only in 7 minutes, which is all you're going to get for coffee. 3 o'clock sharp, we're going to start again. And there's coffee up on the Samnon Terrace. But we're also going to continue this conversation over the next several years and dive down into, we touched the surface of a lot of interesting dimensions of this issue. And so stay tuned, because we're going to be having these guests, among others, come back and dive more deeply. Meanwhile, explore the website and help us build it and improve it. Thank you so much. Please be back here at 3 sharp. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank
you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
All right, great. To be continued. Thanks, Wayne. Really appreciate it.
You should have answered that question. How are you? Good to see you. Yeah, I didn't.
Hey, how are you? Oh, nice to meet you.
Hi, Matt Goodman. How are you? Nice to meet you. Good. At the World Bank, or formerly the World Bank?
Okay. They weren't able to process it fast enough, so.
Thank you.
So that got shot down. I can usually get them in like a day or two, but I know I'm not able to. Yeah, I can't. It's fine. No, it's kind of a new era in Chinese bureaucracy. They're kind of a little more strict, a little more to the rules. You can't really. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you so much.
Gee, maybe I should put on my, can I put on my glasses?
Yeah, you can put on your glasses.
They're very good.
Dr. Brzezinski's going to put on his sunglasses, but that's because he's got a little visiting. He's got this, it's this new kind of cosmopolitan look he's sporting. Actually, it's these lights. They're a little bit of a glare.
It's meant to scare the hell out of you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have all of you here. I would like to say, first of all, how grateful I am that you could all be a part of this. As you can see, this is a major platform that we've decided to invest in through the auspices of the Brzezinski Institute on geostrategy. And so it is our major project, and I'd like to begin actually with that question, Dr. Brzezinski. We were fortunate enough to be able to launch the Brzezinski Institute 2 years ago, but you gave us very specific directions. If we're going to do it, you said, I want it to focus on history and geography. And why don't you share with us your vision? What led you to think about this that way?
Well, obviously, I was not thinking of this particular region of the world only, although I was conscious of the fact that this region of the world is coming into its own and is becoming increasingly significant. Basically, what I meant was something very simple. If you want to be a player on the global scene, you have to have a sense of geography, you have to have a partial sense of history, and you have to have significant ambitions which you understand well, and on the basis of which you can mobilize others. I think it's as simple as that. And I felt that both China and Russia in different ways were oriented that way, and of the two, the Chinese had a broader vision, probably also greater ambition, and very much still unfulfilled expectations.
You know, Americans don't know geography and they don't know history.
That's correct. But they're lucky because they don't have history in the first place.
This is true. I'm sure you confronted that when you were National Security Advisor, that people not having a strategic consciousness about the way the rest of the world is functioning because of our rather unique history.
Well, that's true, but the whole world was differential to the United States still at that time. And I'm not claiming credit for the administration with which I was associated. It's just a question of time. I think the position of the United States in the world has seriously deteriorated. Mm-hmm. And I think fewer and fewer countries think of us as the savior of the world eventually, but more as a country which at best will help to stabilize the world, but not much more than that. And that's why we do need a longer range policy which anticipates what are likely to be the challenges in the next 20 to 30 years, while we can still make important decisions regarding geopolitics and not just worry about global warming, which we will be increasingly in the course of the next 20 to 30 years. And we have to have a vision in which we exploit the assets that we have and we get rid of those which are part of the past but which have been compromised in part by lack of success or unsuitable choices. I have in mind specifically now the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think we are no longer the country that's likely to be the settler of stability in the region. I think we'll be lucky if we can disengage gracefully and create a situation in which others defer to our concerns and are aware of them, don't exceed their prerogatives, but are more willing to play a role in the region, largely because they have no choice. If they don't, the region will be a problem for them. Much more than us, who are so geographically distant.
Well, we could go absolutely around the world endlessly this afternoon with you, but let me pull us back to Asia. You've had this strategic, you've dedicated your whole life to kind of strategic assessment about major developments in the world. We're seeing the rise of China. We're seeing a more assertive Russia back on the global stage. How do you look at this rise of China, the centrality of Asia, and the competition between China and Russia?
Oh, that's a huge and fascinating question. I do think that the Chinese, who are basically very practical people, who are not inclined towards sudden excesses, realize that for the next several decades, America and China can be real partners, although one shouldn't exaggerate the importance of that word, but can be real partners without getting involved in very costly adventures from which either one of them or both of them would suffer dearly. And I think that's doable. The question in that context is, where does Russia fit into that? I think the Chinese would like Russia to be closely engaged, because it is more likely than not that in that setting the Russians will be somewhat more deferential, for a while at least, to the Chinese in order to put us in a more isolated position. And they will not undertake actions that would put Chinese interests at risk. And that, if it works out, may in fact be the best solution, because our allies are not going to be actively engaged in the world. Yes, they'll have the remnants of the atomic weapons, the French, so they can eventually kill some Central Africans if need be, but they're not going to be engaged with the nuclear weapons in world affairs. The British will find it increasingly difficult to finance some of their strategic weaponry. The Japanese, for the time come, unless we have a real break in our relations with the Chinese, will not go nuclear. So in that setting, the United States can play an intelligent role of a sustained and mostly cooperative dialogue with the Chinese, with the Russians on the margin trying to advance their interests, but not being powerful enough to jeopardize the relationship, not only with China, but with us. That's a rather optimal vision, but I think it's actually doable. In that sense, our role in the world can remain quite significant, but not the way it has been throughout much of the Cold War, when we were the pace setters, where we were the deciders, where we were the interveners, either because we had to or we wanted to, but more as a kind of state which orchestrates the interaction of these three principal states, each suspicious of the other two, but each realizing that they're better off accommodating in some degree among the three of them. And if we have that, then by roughly 2030 or so, when we begin to be more significantly affected by the global climate crisis, we will be in a position of some stability and hopefully the capacity for some significant steps forward to deal with the new problem that will be increasingly dominant. If we don't, our future is very uncertain, because we will suffer first, more than the others, if the global climate issues get out of hand for a variety of reasons. And then there will be a temptation, particularly on the Russians' part, to see if they can alter their relative position. Number three in a closely set group of three, but hopefully maybe two. And there will be a further complication there, I think, namely that given the present trends, I think the Chinese, and particularly some segments of Chinese society, and especially the military, are going to be pushing much more hard and much more overtly something that they're already pushing, which is the restoration of China's territorial integrity. And of course, what I have in mind is the big agreement of the 1850s, 1860s.
Yes.
And if you look at the map, you can see what a tremendous change that could entail in terms of global balance in favor of the Chinese.
I think you once told me of a conversation that you had with, I don't remember who it was, Deng Xiaoping, or maybe it was Zhou Enlai or someone, about Russia's history with and having taken land away from China. Do you recall this?
Yeah, I don't remember in great detail, but basically that was the message. And of course that message is exemplified by the dramatic contrast between, let's say, the Chinese provinces right on the edge of the border in the northeast. The Russians across the border. And the contrast between the populations in one versus the other is dramatic in terms of scale.
Yes, very much so.
My associate, Paul, who works in my office together with Corinne, has done maps on this and population sizes and so forth. And it's really quite dramatic, the contrast, and therefore the propensity at some point to start doing something about it.
You know, this whole project is seeing this massive investment in infrastructure, building out with rail lines and road lines, etc. How do you think about the geopolitical implications of expanding infrastructure and potentially the competition in Central Asia?
Well, yes, in the competition, but you know, who will be the competitors? I think the present momentum with this OBOR initiative is with the Chinese, and to some extent, it satisfies the aspirations of the newly independent Central Asian countries. Not all of them. Some of them are closer to Moscow than others, but by and large, they realize that if that line really assumes full-scale exploitation, they're going to be the beneficiaries of it, and it will consolidate their desire to be independent, you know, permanently as independent states. But I am not informed enough to feel confident about my judgment, but my sense is that in this respect, there are still some uncertainties. I think the Russians have been able to stir up at least to one of those countries to expect much more money from the Chinese, and the Chinese are prepared to pay, and that may be complicating the first round. Secondly, I think there's much more opportunity for the Chinese to use this new access to turn southward and to deal with the sort of Central Asian, post-Afghanistan realities in which they're in a position to exploit the temptations that their presence creates. And last but not least, there is still, as I see it, but I don't follow it as closely as you do and your colleagues do, I don't see yet the Russians agreeing to somehow OBOR becoming a vehicle for passage also through Moscow. I think the reality is going to be that maybe there is some sort of side arrangement to gratify Russian pride and Russian needs, at least in terms of passenger travel. But in terms of large volume of goods, east-west, I think it will have to go straight west across the Caspian somehow, or just south of the Caspian, maybe, and deal with the countries that have gained independence and are now in the first post-independence era of deciding on the new leadership, given the disappearance of some top leaders recently and likely disappearance of others soon. And that will be the test of the consolidation of the independence of these countries. But what is remarkable about them is how quickly they have moved towards a kind of self-gratified nationalism, which they sense in the opportunities. I went there first, long time ago. I'm embarrassed to say how long ago, because most of the people here in this room weren't even born then. I know some of them, and I pretend to be co-equal friend with them, but I realize that down somewhere in their heads is the thought, this guy's been around too long. That's life. My job is to defy them and prove them wrong. But in 1950, I went into the Soviet Union and I visited, among others, Kazakhstan. And of course, the Russians were very proud of it, telling me how they have rehabilitated this area and how it's recovering, et cetera, ever since it became part of the Soviet Union. And as I was walking around and looking at these people and listening to their conversations, I was thinking about North Africa, a French colony, quite evidently so on the surface and in reality too. And that there was something here that one day would wake up. And I think we're seeing that right now.
Both
some of the top leaders have gone. Karimov has just gone.
Yes.
The guy in Kazakhstan, what's his name?
Nazarbayev.
What?
Nazarbayev.
Nazarbayev, that's right, Nazarbayev. They'll be going soon. And they're the fathers of the countries. real fathers of the country. I saw Nazarbayev shortly after he became president, and he had decided to build this new capital of Kazakhstan in the remote part of the country. And a lot of his colleagues were laughing at him. And I remembered that he was terribly gratified and pleased when I told him, you're doing something absolutely right. It's a little bit like Washington in the United States. You're creating the capital of a new state that will be remembered because of that, and you will be its architect. And boy, was he pleased to have some sort of, ignorant Westerner, senior graduate student at the time, to be giving him that assessment.
That's interesting. The Russians and the Chinese have had quite different imperial traditions. The Chinese imperial tradition was much more tolerant of independent states as long as they respected the cultural grandeur of China, for example. And Russian imperial tradition was much more structural, wanting to bring people into formal structures of alignment with Moscow. How do you see this imperial competition playing out today?
Well, I think it'll play itself out as a consequence of the developments that have already taken place. There is no restoration of what was once a Russian empire. It is a national state already. And I don't think there's the slightest chance that it would go back. If it was an attempted restoration of the past, I think it would produce a lot of violence and resistance and no benefits to Russia. The Chinese have, I think, a broader view. They're more self-assured, and therefore they don't mind the existence of a community or a culture or a history that is at variance with their own, because they know they so outnumber the people involved in that attempt. It's just staggering. Even if you go to those parts of China in which the minorities have quote-unquote self-rule, it's so obvious that they are part of something much larger than they, and they have to respect it as such. So I think the Chinese will probably become more nationalistic, especially if those frontier issues that have been left semi-open become activist. But beyond that, they're already a remarkably self-confident and intelligent community. And after all, after the United States, they're now the second largest imperial state in a way.
Earlier in your observation, you talked about the crucial role of dynamic of China and Russia and the United States. Can they find a balance, and can the United States find an appropriate role? Now, America is a Pacific power, but it's not an Asian power. How do you see America interacting with China and Russia in this new dynamic?
Well, I don't know whether I can speculate intelligently on this issue, because my knowledge is in some respects limited in that case. But I do think that we should avoid giving the impression that we have an interest, a dominant interest in the Asian mainland. We want to be involved in it. We want to be partners in it. We want to work with those who can be constructive in that region, and notably the Chinese, who are not inclined to excessive ambitions or to kind of frantic desire to improve their posture, like some European countries. They're much more patient and oriented. And the fact that they're beginning to look at the old frontiers seems to me to suggest that that's an issue that's going to become more open. And then they will persist in a quiet and maybe even accommodating fashion, but persist in taking advantage of their enormous population, which today is, at least 10, 15, 30 times larger, 20 times larger than Russia.
Yeah, it's 10 times probably, 1.3 billion, 130 million probably.
Yeah, well, the Russians are 140 million.
Yeah. And going down.
And going down. So I think our role is to deal as well as we can with China, especially since the Chinese realize that quite for some time to come, they will not surpass us technologically or militarily. but they can reach a level in which each recognizes the other as more or less an equal participant and partner. If that doesn't work, we do have the fallback position of Japan and South Korea, and then the other offshore countries along the southern strip that borders on China all the way to the Indian Ocean. And that would be our strategic posture in those circumstances. A great deal depends in that context on how the Russians view their future. If after Putin is gone, they begin to realize that actually, as a leading European state, in some fashion connected as a European state, with a Europe which is not just a flunky of the United States, but shares with the United States certain European connections, and which has, in any case, jointly a stake in a stable relationship with China, we may be able to strike the kind of a balance that we couldn't during the Cold War, because we were all at each other's loggerheads throughout most of it. And we'll always have to be very careful not to be smitten by the other side. So, I'm not terribly worried about it if we're clever. Now, I noticed some tendencies, particularly in the American foreign policy dialogue regarding the future of American foreign policy, in the direction of seeking some sort of a new arrangement in which, without mentioning any names, let's say China will be replaced by India as a principal object of American interest. And I think that will be damaging to the American-Chinese relationship. It might awaken excessive Indian ambitions, but without the same sense of discipline and clarity of thought that the Chinese display. And also, it is a country more likely to be dragged into conflicts with its immediate Muslim neighbors. And so I don't think that would be, in the end, a very good bargain for the United States. But I can see, under some circumstances, that being seriously advocated. And that, I think, would be a mistake for us.
I think that the Indians think of America as a pawn on their chessboard rather than us thinking of them as a pawn on our chessboard, to be perfectly candid. I'm not sure that we share that.
A lot of vanity there, actually, historical vanity.
Yeah, all over, I should say. Let me ask, it was hard for me to first start to comprehend this concept of a reconnecting Asia, because the American government is structured to look at Asia from the coastline. We have an East Asia Bureau, we have a South Asia Bureau, we've got a Near East Asia Bureau in the State Department. In the Defense Department, the Central Asian republics are part of the European Command. We've got a Pacific Command that looks at the water, the littoral. We've got a Central Command that looks at West Asia, but really from the water and a bit of a land focus. We just don't look at Asia in a comprehensive way. You were National Security Advisor and did have a strategic focus. It seems to be hard for us now to understand what's going on because of our structure. How do you see, if you were to be advising the next president, he or she, how would you tell them to contemplate the future of this increasingly connected Asia?
Well, I would think that we would want to have a relationship with China which permits us to retain the traditional relationships that we have with the other non-necessarily mainland Asian countries, and I mentioned Japan very specifically, because I think there is a bond there, born out of suffering, but also out of mutual understanding, and I think that will endure and there will always be a fallback position for us. And I think over time, I think there will be some gradual accommodation between the Japanese and the Chinese, because the incompatibilities are not necessarily of an enduring character, especially with the passage of time. But for us, what we'll have to be aware of is that the period of closest cooperation with the Chinese so far occurred under the president I was working for. China went into Afghanistan. It's not generally recognized, but it did. And it was quite significant in that respect. And there have been other arrangements with the Chinese before that and since then. And some of them have been very important to our security. So I think that element is likely to endure for the foreseeable future. I think the Chinese have a big stake in essentially this kind of triad working out in a fashion in which, like a triangle, one line is longer than the other, and the third one slightly shorter, but all three are interdependent. And I think we can work on that. I think the Russians are not going to be consumed by eternal passions of the kind that manifested themselves when they really, truly saw themselves as the wave of the future, particularly the communist era. A whole new concept of humanity, how to organize it and so forth, which in the end turned out to have been a sham. I think there is going to be a movement in Russia towards sort of greater self-assertion, but not as a flunky either for us or for the Chinese. Maybe this is too optimistic. Maybe we'll slide into some unpredictable conflict, even in the near future. Now, we'll, recall, and others will recall for me for sure, that my estimate was ill-advised, mentally deficient. But there could be a war over the Baltic region in Europe. But I think we can avoid it. We can avoid it.
Yeah. Well, you've outlined really an optimistic future, but I think it has one essential requirement. You have to stay as part of the captain of the team to guide us that way.
Well, we're going to have a new captain of the team. I'm going to be writing an occasional op-ed on the subject.
I hope so. Colleagues, Dr. Brzezinski does have an obligation to leave now at 3:30. So I apologize I'm not able to draw on all of you. But I hope that you felt this was a rich experience just to listen to his thinking on it. Could I ask you, with your applause, to say thank you to Dr. Brzezinski?
Thank you very much.